Hi, welcome class for lecture 2, chapter 2. So I'm just going to dive right in. Go ahead and open your books. Hopefully you guys got something out of chapter 1. I just want to kind of go over what we're going to be learning. Uh, what I'll also encourage you to do during this class, I have the wonderful opportunity to be taking art classes with my little girl every Saturday. If you can, take some classes. She takes a class, and then I also take a class. But I'd really encourage you to try to go to the MFA if you can. And if not the MFA, if you live near Salem, the Peabody Essex Museum, if you live near Gloucester, they have the Marina Museum as well as the Cape Ann Museum. So many great museums, but especially the MFA, if you can go there, it's just fantastic. So while you're studying this, hopefully what we talked about a little bit last time is that, and if you're already into this book, and most of you are probably a little bit further than chapter 2, you realize that ideas and have a significant have a significant influence on art. Art is never actually done in a vacuum, as some people may assume. It's never just, when we think of art, we think of maybe some person just drawing a canvas looking at trees. And that's actually more of probably an American phenomenon. But what we see in a lot of these, sorry, I'm trying to close everything. What we see in a lot of these pieces is a philosophy of life. So I want to go ahead and talk to you a little bit about Greece, and then we'll hopefully talk a little bit about the philosophers and some of the architecture as well. So the early Greece period or the early Greek period had three different ages or periods. We have to understand that Greek thought was very consumed with order and responsibility. And you're going to see that especially when you see the writings of Iliad and the Odyssey. The gods, as much as the gods were there, they thought that they may influence certain events, they may cause certain storms. At the end of the day, for the most part, the gods kind of stayed out of people's lives. It was really up to people to make choice. They had a strong inclination to believe in free will, and that at the end of the day, you can't blame the gods, you can't blame fate, you can't blame luck. You actually have to take things into your own hands. And so Greek thought and literature and architecture really conveys this, that you have to respect the order out of the chaos to function as a civilization. And so they had three different periods, each marked by distinctive artistic achievements. Number one was the Iron Age, and the Iron Age kind of, you saw the formation of the city polis, where the city and the people were actually combined as one. After that, you had the heroic age, where this is really where the Iliad and the Odyssey started to come and become developed. This is where you start seeing some of the vases that we see in this chapter. People who are highly idealized, like Achilles, like Zeus, others. The heroic age show honor, respect, is going to be significant in Greek culture. And then geometric. Geometric is kind of like an evolution of that. We see this especially in the architecture in the Ionic as well as the Doric structures or the columns. We'll see some of the differences on there. That order or geometry that was very, very important, because you can't understand the heroism or the disturbance around you without actually strongly respecting the order. And so, some of the things that we have to see is that, if you just turn to chapter 2.3, this is when you look at some of their religion. One thing that they saw with in Greek religious thought, they did have religious texts per se, but they wanted to convey, or they understood the gods much more to be like people. And they actually found a lot of comfort in that. They didn't necessarily see the gods as perfect or purely omniscient or purely omnipotent, omnipotent, or as knowing all things or being able to do all things. The Greeks actually found comfort more that the gods like to fight it out. And you see this quite a bit. Zeus, for example, getting in sometimes tiffs with some of his some of his colleagues. You see Apollo and Dionysius. And we talked a little bit about that last lecture with the Egyptian, with, you have Isis, destroying Osiris. And then after that, you have, Seth cutting them all up. And then Isis then making love to the sky god. And then everything kind of coming back together. So the Greek, it takes that, but it advances it a little bit more. So in here, you really have gods who have particular roles. So you have Zeus, of course, most of you know, probably he is the king of the gods. Hera is not just the wife, but she's also the sister of Zeus. Ares, son of Zeus, lover of Aphrodite, god of war. Apollo, god of light. Artemis is the twin sister of Apollo, god of wild animals. So what is the point of all these gods? The point of all these gods is really they saw that people had a variety of activity in them, and they could usually see that the gods represented that particular activity. And the activity was not always linear. The activity by itself was not always in relationship with other activities that humans like to do. So if humans, say for example, like to, I don't know, you ever heard this saying that you're a Christian for 6 days out of the week, and then you live like a pagan on one day of the week, or I think it's the other way around. You live like a partier 6 days of the week, and then you act like you're so holy on the holy day when you go to church. The Greeks actually kind of saw that. The Greeks actually saw that people had to hunt, and when you brought this out, we brought out these characteristics of hunting, and we brought out a lot more of an aggressiveness. People also like to make love. People also like to party, i.e. the god of Dionysius. So you had Dionysius, though, this god of partying and wine and not really chaos as much as pleasure and hedonism. And you have that, and then you have another god who is Apollo, light and order. And then you have these two kind of structures kind of coming together and somewhat colliding. But the thing about Greek religion, they were okay with that. And they actually saw the gods, again, leaving things alone and letting people kind of figure it out, and them being symbols of what the people did on Earth. So that's the very first thing. There wasn't a lot of contact between the gods and the people. There was much more just observation that they thought, or at least what they believed, the gods represented. The other thing about the Greeks, too, is that they didn't have a lot of prayer like a lot of Christians, Jews, or Muslims do, or even so much meditation like the Buddhists do. They found that religious, or the problems of human morality, required human rather than divine solutions, and therefore the Greeks really kind of turned to art. That's what art was for, art, literature, because that's actually where at the end of the day, where the Enlightenment comes from. It wasn't so much on divine revelation, it wasn't through prayer. Gods might kind of exist, but again, you have to take things into your own hands. And they liked inconsistency. So that's very relevant when you looked at the Homeric epics, because Homer talked about a lot of these inconsistencies quite a bit. And some of these inconsistencies may be very difficult to understand. So the way that people actually understood Homeric or some of the literature is that the Greeks wanted the people to understand some of the stuff, so they wrote music, or they put a lot of their writing into easy to understand epitaphs, I believe, and that is accompanying their names whenever they appear. So in other words, a lot of the characters that were in the Iliad and the Odyssey were easy to recall. They were easy to remember. So the music, the characters that were in these stories were actually very relatable, but they were also easy. They were relatable mainly because the people actually knew how to remember them through epitaphs as well as musical devices. And that kind of goes on. If you looked on page 56, the author just kind of talks about this is really where music begins in Greek thought, because they wanted people to kind of come together. Remember, thinking about honor, thinking about code, thinking about order, even though the gods are somewhat inconsistent. So I want to kind of back up here for a moment. So the gods are really inconsistent, but they didn't blame gods for the chaos that occurred. How do city polises and how do people survive? People survive mainly through memory, mainly through responsibility, mainly through geometry and order. And when they concentrate on those things, you have a more civilized population. So the Greeks were very focused on their internal locus of control, meaning I have to take full responsibility for my actions, and I can't blame mom and dad or uncle or wife or children on my faults. I have to take full control on those things. But not only that, but they pushed other people to have that same internal locus of control too. Now, that internal locus of control can be very intimidating when you're living in a world where there's war, where there's people dying, all of those other things. And that's why they focused a lot on memory, focused a lot on musical devices, having a particular didactic. And so you see that music starts to become very prevalent because music is actually a very wonderful tool on how to recall a vast amount of information. A lot of the younger students right around, so if you were living in Greece, you actually memorize significant portions of Iliad and Odyssey by the time you were 7 or 8 years old, which is just fascinating when you think about that. And the way they actually understood a lot of these texts was by music, putting everything into a musical structure. So that's what the meter of, if you look at the meter of the Iliad and the Odyssey, a lot of these old works were to be read aloud. They were oral. And in fact, if you ever read the Iliad or the Odyssey, it's probably always best to actually read a lot of it out loud. And so the author gives a point of dactylic hexameter of heroic verse. And what is a dactyl? And a dactyl is just more like just putting things in small musical notation. So a dactyl is much like a quarter note, but it's kind of like this: ta ta da, ta ta da, ta ta da, or ta da, ta da, ta da. And that's a very, very basic musical device. Ta ta da, ta ta da, ta ta da. You know, it's like when you think of all the musical songs out there, it's actually kind of a, you know, it's related to this musical device. It's basic ta ta da, ta ta da. You know, slow, fast, slow, fast, slow, fast. And that's actually how our brains are able to remember these vast amount of information. And they would actually write, according to the meter, they would actually put the meter or put a lot of this, a lot of their poems in that same kind of device so that these little kids can remember that. You know, so the rage of Achilles is right, you know, so the rage of Achilles is against him. So that's how they would actually remember these large pieces of work. The author then goes into the Iliad and the Odyssey. Just the main thing that you need to understand about that is that the Iliad is really understanding about Achilles' rage and the consequences of his rage. So that's the one thing that you need to understand about the Iliad is the Iliad first starts out with the Greek word mene, which actually means rage. And so the rage of who? The rage of Achilles. He's angry. And it actually kind of shows the consequences of this emotional, unregulated bitterness that tends to just swell up in Achilles' heart. If you guys haven't read the story, it's really worth reading. But it's a wonderful analogy on how suppressed rage can cause insurmountable amount of harm to a significant amount of people. And if you know the end, Achilles eventually dies, and Achilles is then buried in a very honorable death. And the thing about Achilles, though, Achilles was, even though he was very rageful and so, he was honored by the Greeks because because that's actually what he put first and foremost, more than anything. He put his honor number one, and that's actually what drove. But the Iliad is actually an analogy because as much as he had a very high honor, he tended to put his rage above his honor. And that's the sadness of the story, because the Greeks would have it the other way around. You're supposed to put your honor number one, your rage is to be right here. And so as much as Achilles is honored, he was also kind of an example of what young men were not to do. Now the Odyssey is somewhat different. The Odyssey is the opposite of that. I'm not going to get into whether or not Homer wrote them, whether he didn't write them. I actually feel that the author spends too much ink on talking about, whether or not Homer wrote them. at the end of the day, who cares? They're written. Let's just move on. It always kind of bothers me. I used to read these. I have read, excuse me, a significant amount of literature on authorship of old ancient Near East texts, whether it's in the Bible or whether it's in Akkadian texts or stuff like that. It always irritates the mess out of me when an author spends like 40 or 50 pages talking about the author. I don't care. Like at the end of the day, I'm like, okay, great. Yeah, he wrote it. Let's move on. What does the text say? I don't know. That's just a little pet peeve of mine. So the author, in my opinion, just spends way too much time talking about whether or not Homer wrote it, whether or not he didn't. Doesn't matter to me. But the Odyssey is the opposite of the Iliad in the sense that Odysseus is actually he's rather than being too lazy, too rageful, he's actually too lazy. So he's just he's sleeping around. He's kind of evading his own responsibilities, and eventually he reunites with his wife after about 400 pages. But it takes a very, very, very long time. And so you have to understand that the Iliad and the Odyssey are metaphors on what's the most important thing in Greek culture, which is honor. And the things that could actually get away from that or get people away from that one main perspective, honor, is rage or procrastination. And so these were really texts, almost like religious texts, but not the same way that you and I think of religion, more of a moral code, and to help people remember and stay, moral in their city polis. So after that, you see a lot of geometric art. So as you can see, I just quickly right there, I talked about a little bit about the Stone Age, but then just very, very little bit. Then they talked about the Heroic Age, and now we're going to be talking about a little bit about the Geometric Age. And the Geometric Age talks much more about conceptual representation. So geometric art is taking things, this is where acculturation really begins to come in. So the thing about Greek society is that city polises, the problem with the city polis is that you had a group of people living all together, and then this group of people, the pro was that they were very, very tight-knit, very, very close. The con was you had way too many people living in the house. So if some of you ever lived with your parents for maybe past the age of 21, for example, no judgment. So you probably understand this a little bit. You like living with your parents. Maybe you like mom and dad. Maybe you don't. But then you realize that after about, when you're 25, 27, 29, you start you start getting really, really angry. You just get easily irritable. Mom and dad are always in your business. You can never have your partner or your boyfriend or girlfriend come over without them knocking on your door. And it's the same way. City polis was very much like that. People were just very, 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 very tight knit. And the pro was like, we're all tight knit. This is our family. The con was everyone. You could see what the con was. So people had to get. This is actually the start of colonialism. Colonialism, is kind of an influx of basically people not being able to get along and saying, okay, I'm going to get out. I'm going to spread out, and I'm going to take over other people. It's been happening for thousands and thousands of years, all right? So every single civilization that was ever started basically started from the effect of colonization. I know a lot of people kind of like to pick on America because America colonized the Native Americans, and I understand that. I understand that we need to be very, very sensitive to that, but you need to understand this. Every single group colonized somebody before them. It's just been going on for thousands of years. Thousands and thousands of years. And this is actually the first record of this, of where people are getting way, way too close and then they have to kind of get out. And so the effect of that, it was actually the use of when they would colonize, they would actually come in contact with different people. And so you started seeing vases that looked drastically different. And this is where you actually see an evolution of art, where it becomes very basic, very conceptual in its orientation to much more optical in its realization. And so you see that in the archaic art, in the archaic period, you see a vast, vast change really within only 15, 30, 60 years. So if you look on figure 212, 213, 214, this is the effect of the Greeks actually getting out and then taking some of the Asia Minor, some other, being influenced by other groups. So if you look at 212, for example, you have a statue that looks a whole lot like the statue um, of, let me just kind of recall my memory. I don't remember that we looked at in Egypt, which was, if you look at, 132 is a statue of Khafre. So we talked a little bit about his strong square head and dynamic. So if you look at 212, you can see that's very close, the same type of representation. You see the foot stepping ahead of him. It's not very realistic. That's more to actually keep the statue in place. But if you compare that statue, look at what happened 70 years later in 212, and look at the in depth, look at the detail, look at the depth, look at his stomach, his chest, his pecs, his biceps. Even look at his hair is much more natural. His face, he almost looks like he has like a kind of like his fat on his face is kind of squeezing his lips. Is much more realistic. So it's a vast improvement just in 70 years between the artist of the first and in this one. And so you continue to see with all these marble pieces. Then if you actually turn the page, 10 years later on 520, look at 215, and look at the if you look at her robe, how realistic it is, and you really kind of see how the sculpture is really playing a lot with naturalism. And the myriad folds, the sweeping curves, the smile on her face, and then you go all the way to the Critios boy on 216, and you see such vivid realism and naturalism. You almost feel like you're looking at a real young man. You can imagine older people looking at these votive statues, and the votive statues were really kind of representing soldiers who had died before them. A lot of these were maybe men that they knew or women that they knew. Can you imagine if you're an older person who actually saw something that was very generic, walking in the main city square, and then all of a sudden you come across this Kyrios boy and 216. What a vast difference, from something that was just almost like a big block of stone to something so in depth you might even be taken aback. Oh my gosh, that's my son. And you could see how in just a few years from the city polis going very internally, then everybody wanting to move out, get away from mom and dad, colonialization occurs, and then you see this huge influx and a huge influence of Greek art. Vase painting also becomes very important as well. One thing that we have to understand about vase painting, two types of vase painting. There's basically black and red. The black vase painting is when they put basically when the figures are black. What would happen is that they would actually draw with a brush the figures, and then they would heat it up, and then they would take it back up. They would then draw the background, and that's actually what you see in 218. But you see the apogee of the red figure technique, and apogee just means it's the highest structure. When you use a red figure, and that was just the opposite. What they would do is they would actually heat everything up, and they would take it out, and then they would draw the figures. And what this allowed was much more in depth, much more detail to the vases than before. And in my opinion, vases have never, it really did reach its peak. I had the wonderful opportunity to go to the Museum of Fine Arts a few weeks ago and seeing some of the vases, and I compared some of them to even more modern vases of the 1800s. In my opinion, humble opinion, I still think the vases at this time period have never been surpassed. Just the in-depth, and you can see that in Figure 219 as well. And so I want to close out with just talking a little bit about you see this in the wanting to bring order. Again, the vases. I want to bring this up too before I close with the Doric versus Ionic structures. The vases also, if you look, there's a significant amount of mathematical symmetry all throughout. Look at all of the V's, all of the circles. Everything is perfectly aligned. So that's not an accident. The thing with art, you want to keep looking at it as much as you can, and because wherever you see, even the top flowers, looks like flowers at the very very top. Everything has a story. Every art piece that you see, a good artist is going to have a story for every tiny weensy detail, to the smile of its face, to the sculpture's or the painting's face, to the way the head is positioned, to whether or not the arm is raised like this, or whether or not the arm is going to be resting against his chin. Always start asking these questions when you're looking at art. Why is, you're invoking that sense of curiosity within yourself. Why is he looking this way and not this way? Why is he up and not down? Because the artist is purposefully, these are hours and hours and years of work, and they are vividly trying to portray a sense of, a particular message to people that would come in contact with them. So there's no accidents in art. You can't just quickly look at it and move on. You have to look at every single tiny weensy detail and ask these particular questions whenever you're looking at. And that's the thing. I would also encourage you too, a little good exercise that you can do when you go to the Museum of Fine Arts or go to Peabody Essex Museum or wherever you go. Get a piece of paper or get a little pad. Go spend $5. Get a pad, a sketch pad, and just look at a piece of art. Spend about 20 or 30 minutes and just try to copy it. Why that's such a good exercise is because you'll see more and more to those pieces that you've never seen before. I remember doing that with a piece in the African section of the Museum of Fine Arts about 6 weeks ago. And I was just staring at it, and the more I looked, the more I just saw like these tiny little details. Like, oh my gosh, there's like little people at the very bottom of his feet. Oh my gosh, this thing right here, it looks like a triangle. And I never even noticed there's a little reed right against his neck. And oh my gosh, there's actually an earring connecting from his ear to the reed to that little guy at the very, very bottom of his foot is actually pulling on it. So you just ask these wonderful questions, and it just expands more and more. That's really the wonderful thing about art, is it invokes that kind of curiosity that no other discipline does. So one more thing too, the Greeks were also very they're very concerned, or they had a big influence on our understanding of peripheral or orderly temples. So if you look at 220, this is a typical Greek peripheral temple. It's mathematically perfect. You have the same amount of columns on both sides, vertical as well as horizontal. And the reason why is because it's architectural orders. That's the most important thing. You have to represent order when the gods aren't always getting along. So it's up to me to represent order. And so there are two types of, and I'm sure many of you have seen these comparisons before, these two types of orders or columns. You have the Ionic and the Doric. And the Doric order represented more of the countryside. It represented more stability. Doric would often be in temples, whereas Ionic was the opposite. Ionic would give you the impression of lightness, almost like the roof was barely holding on. But the other thing too that you can notice in the frieze, you look at the Doric structure, has these triglyphs and metopes. In other words, it was all broken down in threes, whereas the frieze in the Ionic is just blank. It just is continues to go on. But you could really see the difference in the column. In the Doric column, it's just basically flat, and then you have this giant roof landing right on top of it. It's like heaviness. But if you look at the Ionic, if you notice, it's almost like a flower. It looks like the letter I. It's a good way to remember that. But it looks like it's actually coming down. The reason for that, it's almost like it's saying to the roof, yeah, you're heavy, but you're really not that heavy. Look what I can do. I mean, that's really what it's doing. I'm not intimidated with you. And so Ionic would often be represented in more, it might be, people would have plays or humor, or they would go see maybe certain comedic events, whatnot. You could, I'm not going to worry too much about the philosophy. On today's lecture, I just wanted to kind of get you guys, wet your palate a little bit on the difference things that you need to take notice of when you're in some of the questions that you need to be asking when you're looking at these pieces. Again, I wanted to keep these lectures pretty short and sweet because it's a fast class, and keep up the good work. Thanks, guys.